And what I'd like to do now is hand over to Hannes, who's the Hannes is the General Manager of MEGALAC Wilmar, as he'd like to say a few words for us. Thanks very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody from wherever you have joined us today, or later on if you watch the recording of this webinar. We've organized this webinar on animal feed and more specifically on fatty acid nutrition today. And as a general manager, I also on behalf of the colleagues in Asia, America and Europe from supply centers and sales office, I would like to welcome you to this meeting, to this webinar. And thank you for your interest and taking the time to join us. As a short introduction, I would like to raise a couple of points or reasons, if you like, why we are organizing this and why we probably will continue to do that in the future. So at MEGALAC Wilmar, we believe that animal nutrition is and professional farming is much supported by breakthrough technology developments, new application knowledge which is developed, product innovations. And I think that all in all will drive efficiency and sustainability in the industry. This sounds indeed pretty big. And if you have such beliefs as a company, that comes with high ambition, or it is actually a high ambition. And we do have these ambitions. We're working extremely hard on them with a team from MEGALAC Wilmar and from both the partners. But we also acknowledge that in this total industry, in the agricultural industry, we will not achieve them completely on our own. We need to partner. So, for example, with regard to sustainability, we worked the last couple of years very hard to build up a sustainable product portfolio with high standards and traceability of all our palm-based products. And we also have in our portfolio non-palm-based products. However, in this example, to make the change in the industry or to help to support the industry to make the change, we also need to find partners with whom we work closely to make it all happen. And that's what we're doing together with NGOs and trade organizations and other organizations in the field. And you have seen the last couple of months and beginning of last year as well, some events organized by us to try to make that change and to help the industry to do it. Another good example is what we're doing today. So if you look at science or technology and knowledge development, maybe you know that MEGALAC is already produced by MEGALAC for 35 years. So you could say there should be quite a big amount of experience for the animal nutrition industry. And there is. But also if you want to continue to make that change, if you want to continue to develop, also in this field, we like to partner. We like to partner with leading institutes, universities, test centers, key suppliers, and also key strategic customers. I think that will give the new insight, that will provide us information to develop new products and to give the solutions. The challenges in the professional farming and dairy industry are big enough. So I think we need to bring together the available sources and assets to work on these solutions. Today's webinar is a good example of such a partnership with a representation of leading institutes from strategic partners and with John Newbold, Jonas De Souza and Richard Kirkland from MEGALAC Wilmar. Now, if this was a music festival, and we all missed those festivals already for a couple of months now, I think that we would say that we have a pretty good lineup. So I'm very happy that people could join and that they are available as guest speakers for today. So today, not 100% sure how this meeting will end, and because usually there is not time in the end, so I would like to thank you already, the guest speakers now, and also our host Laura and the team that's helping us as well. So with the risk that if I would continue, this would be kind of a commercial. So without further ado, I would like to hand back to Laura, who will introduce the first speaker of today, and I hope that everybody enjoys the webinar. And wishing you well, stay healthy, and hope to see you again at another occasion. Thank you. Laura, back to you.
Thanks, Hannes. Thanks for the intro. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first fatty acid nutrition rock star, Dr. Richard Kirkland, the Global Technical Manager for Feed Fats for Volac Wilmar. Over to you, Richard.
Okay, thanks for the intro, and hello everyone from different parts of the world. So I think we've got a very large attendance today. We look to be into the hundreds from the delegate list that I've seen most recently. So right across the globe. So that's very good to see. So I'm very much on the introduction side of things as we lead into the two visiting speakers that we have subsequently. So I'll really just start with a very top level introduction to really why we're talking about fat and interested in fats. What are the big picture things we need to have view at from the very start, and then lead into what the subsequent presentations will actually be around. So what we need to remember in the very first instance, if I can get my slide to move, which at this moment I can't. There we go, finally. So we need to start at the very top, really, at the very basic aspect of what we're looking at in nutrition, recognizing that fat is one of the key macronutrients that we have to consider in diet. So it's an essential nutrient. We can't have optimal milk production when we're predominating on with dairy cows in particular, or any other animal species, if we don't balance the macronutrients. So we need to really move farmers on from a position where the key interest in diets is protein and crude protein typically, and what's the protein level, what's the fiber level, what's the starch, what's the sugar in the diet, but they need to also look in every occasion at what the fat concentration, and we're still talking here in terms of crude fat, what is the percent of crude fat in the dry matter of the diet that you have formulated. So one of the key macronutrients, let's not forget that, and we have guidelines and we have rules of thumb that have been established and developed over the last few decades in terms of recommendations that we can give that are available for how much crude fat we should be looking at in a dairy cow's diet. When we look at where fat actually comes from, again we're still talking on the basis of crude fat here, and we see actually most of the typical raw ingredients, if we want to call them that, are actually quite low in fat. So if we look at our cereals, our wheats and our barleys, for example, typically they're only around 1.5 to 2% fat in the dry matter of those cereals. When we look at forages, particularly our green ryegrass type products, typically we'll only expect maybe around 2.5–3% fatty acids in the dry matter of forages. So putting a diet together from those typical ingredients will only give you a total fat in the dry matter of around 3 to 3.5%. Whereas we know, if we take the example of high yielding dairy cows, we know we need to be closer to 6% plus to meet actual fatty acid requirements on an absolute basis. So we can get some extra fat in the diet by looking at some of the more of the byproduct type materials, such as brewers' grains and the palm kernels and the distillers' grains, where we can see 8, 10, maybe even up to 15% fat in those ingredients, but come with various problems associated with that as well, of course, that we need to be careful of. And so if we want to get really up to the levels we need to be, particularly for the high yielding dairy cow, we will balance rations with high fat supplements. So typically we'll see those products in the market which will range from around 84% fat as the calcium salt products up to 100% fat with the dried, more saturated type of fatty acid supplement. And we are talking about fats here, but what we're actually talking about is fatty acids. So in the same way that we try to move from crude protein into amino acid as being the key parameter, we talk about fatty acids as the key components of fat nutrition. And I've presented here the two examples of palmitic acid and oleic acid, which will be the two fatty acids we'll be concentrating on today, as they are the two key fatty acids where all the latest research data over the last recent number of years have been centered. So really it's just to emphasize just how simple actually the fatty acid molecule actually is, because they are simple fatty acid chains of carbon atoms, as you can see, surrounded by hydrogen atom. In the case of palmitic, of course, it's a 16 carbon chain and a saturated fatty acid. And we look at the another example there at the bottom with the oleic acid, where we have an 18 carbon chain. And in this case, we have a couple of hydrogens missing, giving us this double bond structure where we have this structure and 2 hydrogens missing. But other than that, we have really see very small differences in structure, but they really will have very large differences in effects, as you'll start to see from the next presentation. So whenever we're looking at fatty acids that we actually put into a dairy cow's diet, well, although we can pick up over 400 fatty acids in milk, actually, typically and commonly, we really only add around 5 individual fatty acids into a dairy cow's diet, because that's what most of the standard ingredients will contain. So we have the upper 2, the palmitic and stearic acids, the 2 saturated fatty acids, which are very high melting point, as you can see. We need to heat those to 60 or 70 degrees before they will melt. So certainly solid at room temperature. And then we come into oleic acid. The other one we're interested in is typically liquid at room temperature, our monounsaturated fatty acids. And then we have the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, 18-2 and 18-3. So again, the fatty acids are really very important. We see palmitic acid, of course, at the C16. The name comes from the fruit of its origin, i.e. palm fruit, where it predominates. Oleic acid, of course, comes predominantly, for example, from olive oil. So again, the names are very much linked to the fatty acid content of these materials. And what we're primarily interested in is these 2 fatty acids, the palmitic and oleic acid, because really there's been a great deal of research centered within the last small number of years, and that has been centered primarily, I think, at Michigan State University, where a lot of the publications have come out, as many of you will be aware if you're following the scientific literature. So we do see, when we look at different oil types, we do see very different fatty acid profiles. So just put up a few examples here of different vegetable oil sources and as well as fish. And we see that in general, a vegetable oil will predominate in one particular fatty acid. So when we look at rapeseed, it's very similar to olive oil. The big predominance fatty acid there is oleic acid at over 60% of the total fat in the ration. When we look at our cereals, well, we typically see our cereals being high in the omega-6 linoleic acid, C18-2, as you see here with maize and with soya, but true for most of our vegetable oil crops. Fish is obviously one of the odd ones where we get these very long chain omega-3 fatty acids. And we come then to palm oil, again, as I've said, as the name suggests, it's where palmitic acid predominates, and it's the only, when we're looking at a source of palmitic acid, palm oil is really the only source in nature where we find high levels, concentrated levels of palmitic acid. So really a very interesting oil source for us in nutrition. So as I say, we're primarily looking at palmitic and oleic, and you can see where those predominate within, if you're looking to source those type of fatty acids. So moving away from the specifics of fatty acids and what actually happens when we're trying to increase the level of fat in dairy cow rations, and to increase the level of fat by supplying the particular and specific types of fatty acids we actually want to achieve. And of course, in the rumen, we want to see this type of scenario where we have lots of rumen bacteria and protozoa and other microflora digesting the fiber that the cow consumes, and we need a very stable rumen environment to ensure that happens. But of course, what happens when we add high levels of fat into a ration, where we simply add our fish oils or vegetable oils, or many of the high fat ingredients like brewer's grains, for example, are a big risk. That fat becomes liquid in the rumen, and really, in very simple terms, will physically cause an oil slick within the rumen. So we will get this very sticky mess within the rumen. So a lot of negative effects to that, where we get the sticky oil, where it will physically coat the fiber particles in the rumen. So the rumen bacteria can't attach themselves to break down that fiber. Many of the individual fatty acids that are in vegetable oils are directly toxic to the fiber digesting bacteria. So all of those consequences will lead to a reduction in fiber digestion, which of course we don't want. We also get extensive biohydrogenation within the rumen of the unsaturated oils, with production of a whole series of biohydrogenation intermediates in the form of trans fatty acids. And of course, as many of us are aware, where we're in that scenario, then we will end up with reduced milk fat and milk fat depression. So it's certainly a scenario we need to avoid while trying to balance the total fat and the fatty acid requirements of dairy cows. So that's really why we got to the stage in the early days, back in the late 70s and coming into the early 80s, where the calcium salt technology was developed. Taking the example of the MEGALAC, which will be referred to later in some of the research data, where we're able to change those sticky liquid oils into solid granules, which are insoluble in the rumen, and allows us to increase the fat and supply those fatty acids, unsaturated fatty acids, through the rumen, such as our oleic acid, which we need to get through the rumen for absorption in its metabolically effective status. So big developments there, the calcium salts, and then we've moved on to some of the higher melting points to supply other types of fatty acids as well. So that's the very broad picture. And then the last couple of slides, just to lead us more directly into the very new research data, which Dr. De Souza will highlight. And it's really bringing this whole new concept of nutrient partitioning in terms of where is energy consumed by a dairy cow partitioned to. So does the animal get fatter? Does she produce more milk? Does she produce more milk fat, for example? And I've just put a couple of slides up here from, again, this is the first of the Michigan State data, really, meta-analyses data from a number of studies pulled together and presented at the American Dairy Science Conference. And this is from Professor Adam Locke's group, who many of you will be familiar with. And again, this is all part of Dr. De Souza's work, which you referred to in the next presentation. But just as an introduction, where we're starting looking at primarily this effect of the palmitic to oleic acid ratio, and in the meta-analysis data here, with quite a large number of variation of observations now coming into these calculations. And you look at these, what we would call the typical high C16 type supplements, where we have around 80% palmitic acid that a lot of you will be familiar with feeding at farm level, and compare the effect of the energy output to body reserves compared to a control animal not receiving a fat supplement. And you see the effect there is basically neutral, or in fact slightly negative in terms of the energy partition to body reserves. If you look at the effect of adding an increasing amount of oleic acid, so this is the rumen protected calcium salt form of oleic acid to allow us to get it through the rumen, we see much greater partitioning into body reserves and a significant effect of that. So you start to see the real significance of how individual fatty acids can affect the response that we'll see in a cow. And of course, if you're at farm level and you're looking at these two different types of supplement, or these balance of fatty acids, what you see, of course, is the change in body weight or the change in body condition. So again, where you see the effect of less partitioning into body weight, into body reserve, so we see a loss of body weight, or certainly a tendency towards a loss of body weight. When we supply more of the rumen protected oleic, we get an increase in body weight or an increase in condition. So very contrasting effects, and again does support the data that we've seen and that will be presented shortly, of how oleic acid, for example, can specifically stimulate partitioning of energy into body fat. So very useful summary data here in terms of, well, it's now translating that into what this means at practical farm level. So very easy to manipulate on farm in a practical scenario. There's lots of our high palmitic products around. In our own range, we have the Megafat 88 with 88% C16. The Megamax is the new development based on the research data of this 60-30 ratio. And that is my basic introduction. I'll pass now on to Jonas. Lots more information available on the social levels here if you wish to follow that up.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Richard. Really enjoyed that. So now we're going to hand over to Dr. Jonas De Souza. Jonas is the Technical Services Manager at Purdue Agribusiness USA. Jonas attained his PhD from Michigan State University, working quite closely with Professor Adam Locke's group, researching all aspects of fatty acid nutrition. Thanks, Jonas. Over to you.
I'd like to start thanking MEGALAC Wilmar to putting together this webinar. I think it's bringing knowledge to industry is always a good tool, and these days where we are all still in some sort of home office, I think this technology is really helping us to bring information quickly. I'd like to start talking a little bit about some of the work that I did when I was at Michigan State, when I was a student at Michigan State, where basically my thesis focusing looking to how can we vary the dietary ratio of different fatty acids affecting dairy cow metabolism, and how can we take advantage of that. So I think Richard already introduced really well this topic. I think we have to move on from the concept that we consider fats as solely as a source of energy in our diets, and consider that really what we are feeding are these building blocks that are the fatty acids, and each fatty acid will have a specific effect on the metabolism. So we learned a lot in the last few years on how individual fatty acids will differently affect milk production and milk components, how they will affect digestion, partition of nutrients, and also when you think about how that can affect long-term effects, including health and reproduction in cows. So I think the foremost take-home message here is let's talk about fatty acids and what they can do, and move on from the concept about looking to total fat in a diet. And to kind of jump into this concept, I'd like to start presenting this trial. This was my first PhD work. We did this trial with mid-lactation cows, and here the objective was very simple, was look at the effect of varying that fatty acid profile of the supplemental fat on production response of dairy cows. So we feed 4 different diets here: a control diet with no added fat, and 3 fat supplemented diets. So the 3 fat supplemented diets were fed at the same total fat level, so there is no difference in total fat level between these diets, but we vary the profile. So we fed a high palmitic acid with 80% of palmitic acid, 10% oleic, 10% for other fatty acids, and on that 80% fraction, then we on the other 2 treatments, what we did is we replaced about half of that palmitic acid for either stearic acid or oleic acid. So when we look to response in energy correct milk, basically energy correct milk accounts for the change in fat and protein. We did see that all fat treatments increase energy correct milk, but the magnitude of the response was dependent on the profile. So we get better energy correct milk when we drive more palmitic acid, about 2.6 kilograms more energy correct milk on these cows. And what I think is very interesting is when we drop that palmitic acid on the supplemental fat to about half, we saw about half of the response. So really indicating to us that palmitic acid seems to be a driver to energy correct milk. When we look to body condition and body weight on these cows, here I'm plotting body weight. What's interesting for us is that these are all cows in post-peak cows, all cows in positive energy balance. So you see all cows are gaining weight, but again, the magnitude of that weight gain depend on the profile. So surprisingly for us at the time was that the combination with palmitic and oleic that generate better body weight gain. So after this trial, we kind of narrowed down and did a series of studies looking more to ratios of palmitic and oleic and how that really affected, because really on this trial what indicates to us is we could drive energy towards the mammary gland or body weight based on how we vary these 2 fatty acids. And to summarize these, we put together, still didn't publish this, but a few years ago, put together some of the data, individual cow data that we have from Michigan State, looking into that, and we calculate how much from the energy in the diet end up in the milk. So that's what we call energy partition to the milk. So like 65% represents 65% of the energy intake end up in the milk, and there's a milk energy output. There's a calculation that count fat, protein, lactose. So what was interesting for us when we looked at this is we plot how much palmitic acid we were supplying those cows, and how much palmitic acid after that, how much energy end up in the milk. So as you can see here, there was a linear relationship between palmitic acid intake and how much energy end up in the mammary gland or ended up in the milk. So think about these, in a simple way. That palmitic acid we have that effect in terms of driving nutrients to be used at the mammary gland, and that is kind of the main benefit of this fatty acid when we think about lactation and how can we harvest the potential of this fatty acid. On the other hand, when we look to oleic acid, again, the same analysis here, looking to intake of oleic acid, we saw a linear relationship as we increase oleic acid intake on partition of nutrients towards body weight. So kind of has this opposite effect on driving nutrients away to the mammary gland to be used in other tissues and better use as in body reserves on post-peak cows. So because of these effects on post-peak cows, then of course our question was what would happen if we start thinking about a transition cow. So we know a transition cow has a huge increase in their requirements. So the transition period, if we think about those 3 weeks pre-calving to 3 weeks post-calving, so roughly, if we round up like a month before calf and month after calf, there's huge increases in demand for nutrients. If we compare in terms of requirement, a 30 kilo on that lactation compared to that same cow during the pregnancy, that is about a 3 times increase in glucose and energy requirement, and also a huge increase in fatty acids and amino acids. So although a lot of people talk about energy balance, I would say cows entering a negative nutrient balance is not only energy. They will mobilize protein, they will mobilize fat, they will mobilize minerals as well to meet those requirements. So it will be normal that high producing cows will lose weight on that in beginning of lactation, because it's a metabolic programming that we have. But it's about the degree, when that body weight loss or that mobilization is pronounced, then this can lead to problems, and we can enter in states where we have higher degrees of inflammation and oxidative stress, and that really can lead to subsequent problems in performance and as well reproduction. So really can impact that lactation performance of the cow. So having this concept of the palmitic and oleic that we brought from our initial studies with post-peak cows, we start asking the question about what would happen if we vary those ratios on that fresh cow diet. We know that is the most stressful and most challenging period in terms of nutrition. How can we maybe altering the fatty acid profile, change metabolism of those cows? So this is a study was just accepted for publication in the Journal of Dairy Science, so it should be coming out soon. Journal of Dairy Science. We use 56 multiparous cows in a block design, and we fed those cows 4 different diets. A diet containing a control diet, no supplemental fat, normal, Midwest US fresh cow diet, I would say. And then we add 3 different fat supplemented diets at 1.5% of diet dry matter, varying the profile. So a 80-10 with 80% palmitic, 10% of oleic. And then we increase 10 units of oleic, replacing 10 units of palmitic acid. We fed these diets for the first 24 days of lactation, around where most of the dairies will make movements, on that fresh pen. And then after that, we put all the cows in the same carryover diet, and we evaluate if there was any carryover effect of supplementing fat. So there was no added supplemental fat on that. Jumping into the results here, what we observed was, start with that 80-10. It was very similar what a previous study we also did with high palmitic acid supplements. Is there was no effect on feed intake. There was a pronounced increase in energy correct milk. We are talking about 4 or 5 kilos of energy correct milk here. When we think about this, that response is really fast. So if we compare the response of palmitic acid in early lactation and fresh cows compared to later in lactation, is even more pronounced, the effect on energy correct milk and fat yield in these cows in early lactation. But there was some more body weight loss on those animals at the beginning of lactation on that 80-10 treatment. Well, how much this is an issue, I think, is debatable because if you consider there is body weight loss, this may be an issue long term in terms of reproduction, but we didn't see in our trials any health issues with that. So I would say as long as we manage that body condition and body weight loss at the beginning of lactation, this can or cannot be a problem. I would say it will depend on the association with other factors as well. But when we increase that oleic acid in the supplemental fat, this is one of the most interesting finds for me was we tended to see an increase on feed intake on those cows as we drive more oleic. And this is kind of related with some of the plasma hormone changes that we also saw. So as we feed more fat, if you consider feeding more fat and cows are tending to eat more, it's kind of go against what a lot of people say. So again, it's not about feeding fat, it's feeding the right profile. And I think this tackles as well this problem. If we look to energy correct milk, by the second week, there was no treatment difference on that energy correct milk. So although they increase it, 80-10, that is also by the second week at the 630 and 720, as we can see, were at the levels of the 80-10. But the advantage was on the case of 630 here, there was no additional body weight loss. So you achieved that higher energy correct milk without compromising that body weight at the beginning of lactation. Jumping in here then into the carryover period. So after those 24 days, we put all the cows in the same diet. And I think this is interesting looking at is we did see that cows that receive fat in general, they peak higher than the control cows. So even though we remove the fat, they still peak higher. So it indicates to us that really what we do on that beginning of lactation can have a carryover effect and a really pronounced effect on that lactation performance. And when we think about cost of supplementation as well, we should consider that the investment that you make in a fresh cow may pay off over your lactation. So don't only consider what happened on the period that you're supplementing, but I think evaluating carryover is really important. When we look to body weight here, there was no difference in body weight after that period or the carryover period. We see a tendency for all the groups the cows start to recover in condition. So because this was only done in the fresh period, then the next question, of course, was, okay, what would happen if instead of feeding only on the fresh, we have feeding for, let's say, the first 10, 12 weeks of lactation, where most, depending on how you group cows, we see a lot of dairies that would do that. You have like a high pen or a breeding pen that we call a breeding pen. So really depends how you group animals, but would they have benefits instead of only feeding that first month if we feed for a longer period? So to answer that question, we did this following up study again in Michigan State, 56 multiparous cows. And then here we set up treatments in a different way. So on that fresh period that we're going to call those first 24 days of lactation, we fed half of the cows in a controlled diet and half of the cows in a 630 calcium salt supplement. So we brought the idea of the 630 to this experiment. And then when the cows switch on to that high diet on the day 25th of lactation, half of the cows that were in the control, they remain on the control diet, half switched to the fatty acid, and the other way around as well. So that way we factorialize with timing. So we want to answer not only if we should be feeding, but when we should be feeding. So jumping into the results here, a bit different than the previous results is, in this case, we didn't see effect on feed intake at the beginning of lactation. And although there is a numerical change for the fatty acid treatments, it was not statistically significant, the increase in milk volume. When we look to that peak period then where we cross over the treatments, there was no overall effect on feed intake. So if you look, we're feeding a calcium salt here at early lactation, and I know there's a lot of people that still have concerns with feeding salts. It's not about the salt. It seems to be related with the profile, because we didn't see a negative effect of feeding on this trial. And that is some other trials that would support that as well. But when we look to the milk yield, this is what I think is interesting, is when we break down, we saw that the cows that receive fat or receive that 630 supplement in the fresh period, so the first 24 days, they produce on average 2.7 kilograms more on the peak period, regardless of the diet they were. So there was a carryover effect as well. But also as adding the fat on the diet here on the peak period increase milk production by an extra 2.5 kilograms. So if we compare the cows that were always under control with the cows that were always or the whole period on that fatty acid program, that was the highest difference that we have. So this is looking milk volume, looking to energy correct milk here. Energy correct milk is accounts for the yield of fat and protein. So we did see benefit, statistical significance to the group that received fat here. So there was greater energy correct milk on those cows at the beginning with no extra body weight loss here. And body weight was not affected by treatments through the whole period. But when we look here, it was similar. We saw about 2.9 kilos as a carryover effect, in addition 3.6 kilograms of energy correct milk by adding that fat on the peak period. So the question is, do we need to feed the whole period? If you feed the whole period is where we see the most of the response compared with control. But if for some practical reasons you cannot feed on your fresh, that is still benefits of adding that supplement. It's just the magnitude of the response is going to be different. Why oleic acid? Why oleic acid will have that effect on metabolism and really don't affect that body weight change? Well, there is also this nice study coming from Michigan State where they really want you to know if it was oleic acid or not, because when you're feeding a calcium salt or oleic acid in the rumen, it can be converted in other fatty acids as well. We know that not all fat that we fed is protected. So this is a nice study. They infused oleic acid in the abomasum of these cows. They took it for the first 14 days after calving, and then they took adipose samples. I think what's interesting here is still work in progress, but that was an effect on lipolysis. So here it's showing that the adipose tissue of the cows that were infused with oleic acid had lower lipolysis, so they were releasing less fatty acids than the adipose tissue of the control cows. And this seems to be related with this improving insulin sensitivity. So we know that during lactation, the tissues becomes more insulin resistant, and it seems that oleic acid helps to restore that insulin sensitivity, and probably that's why we see these effects in terms of body weight and changes in energy partition. So in summary here, what we saw from this series of studies is that When we fed supplements that contain both palmitic and oleic, we saw increases in end-of-tract milk compared with no added fat in the diets. I didn't present here, but some of the effect of the oleic was not only on the production and body weight, but we also see reduction in plasma NIFA and also an increase in plasma insulin in these trials. And we really think that the effect of the oleic is somehow related, or at least in part related, with this improvement in insulin sensitivity. So a couple of considerations here just to finish my presentation is that I believe that fatty acids should be considered in the diets for transition early lactation cows. I think we have to move on from the concept that we shouldn't be feeding fat for fresh cows. What fat to feed? I would say design your nutrition programs around your objective. The first question I ask when I talk with people is why you're feeding fat, what you're trying to achieve, and then maybe you design your program around your objectives. Consider the individual fatty acids that different supplements will bring. That is other factors that are important in stage of lactation, production level. I think John will talk more about specifically how you can manipulate fatty acid over lactation in a more practical way. And pay attention not only on things that you can measure daily, like milk yield and components, but consider your long-term effects as well, changes in body weight, energy balance, and how that can affect reproduction. Also should be part of your decision when you're choosing a supplement. With that, I would like to thank mainly Dr. Locke group here. I had the privilege to be part of this group. I still consider myself part of the group, but it's really rewarding to be part of a group when you're in such a cutting edge knowledge and bringing new ideas and innovation that can move the industry forward. So big thank to everyone in the group that help and MSU in general. I'll leave my email here if anyone wants to contact me with further questions. And with that, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. De Souza. That was a really great presentation, and thanks for coming to work with us on this. So last but not least, we have Professor John Newbold. John has a wealth of industry experience and is now Professor of Dairy Nutrition at Scotland's Rural College. So it's my pleasure to now hand over to John. Thank you, John.
This afternoon is really quite simple to recap on some of the things that have been mentioned so far in relation to fatty acids for fresh cows. And I'm going to focus in particular on the two experiments where the Michigan State group has evaluated the ratio of palmitic to oleic in fresh cows, and describe these as the first of those experiments, originally presented by Jonas De Souza at the American Dairy Science Association conference in 2018, and as Jonas said, now a full manuscript accepted for publication in Journal of Dairy Science, coming out soon. And then the second experiment, the one presented at the conference this year, back in June, a virtual conference by Pineda et al., and an experiment on which both Richard and myself had the pleasure of participating with Jonas and with Professor Adam Locke. For me, I think from these two experiments, examining the ratio of palmitic to oleic in fresh cows, there are three key findings. I'll just have a slide on each of those. And one more slide then to focus on some of the practicalities, how that was delivered to the cows, and finishing with a few thoughts about where this research might go next. So the first of the three findings from these two experiments, compared with the low-fat control treatment, the high C16 supplement in these fresh cows gave more milk, but compared with the low-fat control, it also drove more body weight loss. This was observed in the first experiment of Jonas De Souza. In contrast, the high C18 supplement, the 60-30 blend, also gave more milk compared with the low-fat control, but this time without a change in body weight loss. This nutrient partitioning effect that Jonas has explained. This was observed in both of those experiments. It begs the question, if with the C18 supplement, if there hasn't been this effect on body weight loss, where's the extra milk coming from? Well, obviously there's the energy provided by the fat supplement itself. And I think it's worth noting at this point that some of the effects of the unsaturated fatty acid, oleic acid, when arriving in the small intestine, can have a beneficial effect in increasing overall fat digestibility. So it's not just the fat content provided by the supplement, it's what it can mean for the digestibility of other fatty acids in the small intestine. A nice illustration of this was this other work reported at a conference in 2018, also from Michigan State University, that we were happy to be involved with. And this shows the response of fatty acid digestibility to infusion of oleic acid past the rumen. So avoiding all the question marks about what's happening in the rumen, simply the delivery of increments of 18-1 to the small intestine infused into the abomasum. And as you can see, total fatty acid digestibility increased. This was a significant linear response over those 4 levels. So again, one reason why the 18-1 can give you a kick in milk yield without stimulating extra body weight loss. It's just got a higher digestibility. The second point that I think is really interesting from this fresh cow work is the carryover effect. So the benefits of the 60-30 high oleic fatty acid mix, when it was offered in the fresh period only, continued into the peak lactation. We see this in both of the studies. So in experiment 1, De Souza et al. 2018, the fat supplement was given from 1 to 24 days in milk, and taking energy corrected milk yield as the variable here, that gave an 8% increase. The carryover effect in days 25 to 60, when the fat supplement was no longer being fed, was still significant, 7%. And in the second experiment, Pineda et al. 2020, of response is seen. Overall milk yield was just a little bit lower in this population of cows, but again, feeding that supplement from 1 to 24 days gave a 6.6% increase in energy corrected milk yield, just the difference between those two means, and the carryover effect was 5.6% into that later period. Interesting to speculate why that response might be occurring. But the third point is that even with the carryover effect, you still do get an additional benefit if you continue to feed the supplement through to the peak period. So 4 lines here is just a schematic representation of some of the results that Jonas showed in detail earlier. So 4 treatments. In blue, we have animals that didn't receive a fat supplement, either in the fresh period or in the peak period. In orange, no fat supplement in the fresh period, but they received the fat supplement in the peak period. Grey, fatty acids first, but not in the peak period. And then in yellow, of course, the fatty acids throughout. So in the fresh period, when there were cows received the fat supplement, 3 kilo response of energy corrected milk yield. As you can see from the grey line compared with the blue line, there is that carryover effect, but then continuing to feed the fatty acids, the yellow line gave a total response of about 5 kilos per day in the peak period. Obviously, economics will determine whether these responses continue to be worthwhile. Okay, so what about delivering these benefits? This is the shot of the diets that were fed in this work, the second experiment of Pineda et al. 2020. Just point out there in yellow, the fat supplement was replacing soya hulls. So yes, we've got an increase in the overall energy content, of course, by doing that, with the MEGAMAX product included at 1.88% of the total ration dry matter in a I guess, a fairly typical Midwest diet. I've translated the alfalfa to mean lucerne, clearly a maize silage, alfalfa, maize grain-based diet with that fairly typical combination of the ground maize grain and the high moisture maize grain as well. And in terms of grams per day, the figure right at the bottom of the chart here, obviously a difference in intake between peak cows and fresh cows. So in fresh, they're getting about 400 grams a day of the product, and at peak, on gram per day basis, about 530. So where does this lead to next? Some thoughts about where research and practice might want to go. Well, clearly there's more to learn. There always is in research, as I'm sure we're all very well aware. I really do like that piece of work that Jonas showed from work of Dr. Contreras and Professor Locke, colleagues at Michigan State, beginning to look more mechanistically at what the oleic acid is doing in relation to adipose tissue and the sensitivity of that adipose tissue to insulin. And that emerging work seems to provide a good mechanistic basis for, you observe with the nutrient partitioning effect, with a higher oleic acid tending to partition absorbed nutrients more towards body reserves rather than driving greater body tissue mobilization in early lactation. I mentioned earlier on, very intriguing. What is happening to the cow? Where is it happening that accounts for that carryover? Are we having effects at the level of the mammary gland in terms potentially of the recruitment of epithelial cells to perform milk secretion, or perhaps slowing the decline of epithelial cells through the process of apoptosis? We don't know. Or alternatively, is it simply in effect resetting the nutrient partitioning that allows that response to continue? I think that remains an interesting question. And it's an important one, clearly, because it is relevant to the economic value of when to best target the use of a fat supplement. Which takes on to the third point there, the economic benefits of managing this ratio across a lactation. So trying to suggest that this ratio of the palmitic to oleic, C16.0 to C18.1, could be a useful parameter to think about when formulating rations. And to apply that in a very theoretical way, thinking about milk yield, or perhaps I should say energy-corrected milk yield as the output, then against the schematic model of a lactation curve shown here, the argument would be that early on in lactation, we want to keep that ratio fairly low, favouring the oleic acid at the expense of the 16.0 to manage the nutrient partitioning and avoid the excessive mobilisation of body fats that could predispose towards fatty liver, ketosis, and so on. There could be an argument on the basis of energy-corrected milk yield that as you get past peak production and into the declining phase of lactation with a cow that is securely pregnant, then you might want to be managing partitioning more towards the production of milk and milk fat at the expense of body reserves. And I think the work to explore the optimum combination of these different fatty acids on a whole lactation basis remains to be done. Whether or not there is a tangible benefit from using two different ratios at different stages of lactation, rather than the convenience, perhaps, of using a single ratio and a single product throughout. So I think the new data presented today, so it's not so new, going back a couple of years to Jonas's original fresh cow ratio study. I think they're consistent with this concept. Keep the ratio low until peak, to get more milk without driving the use of body fat, and potentially use C16 more tactically later in lactation on the basis of the response in energy-corrected milk yield. Okay, and I think that's me done trying to recap on the work that we've shared with you this afternoon. I think I'll hand back to Laura.
Lovely. Thank you so much, John. It's been great to see that there have been quite a few questions coming into the chat box, and whilst we aren't going to get a chance to answer all of those questions today, what we will do is we will directly reply to the people that asked those questions after the event. I would just like to say a big thank you to our fantastic expert speakers today, Dr. Kirkland, Dr. De Souza and Professor Newbold. I think everyone's really enjoyed your presentations, and it's been a pleasure to be able to collaborate with you all. I'd like to try and finish as early as possible because I appreciate we ran over a wee bit. However, there's a couple of questions. There's one odd question I'll ask now, and that's open to all the panelists. And it's a question about fat addition to compound feed pellets. The pellet reaches about 80 degrees Celsius in the machine. What happens to fatty acids then? Do you have any advice when producing pellets with fats, please? And I'll open that up to all of you, please.
Maybe one I'll comment on initially, Laura. I think that's a common issue in the feed mills that we have to deal with, and that we come across from a very practical sense, because there is a big effect on pellet quality, as is being asked. So certainly when we're feeding the likes of the high palmitic products, where we have melting points of around 60 degrees or maybe even slightly less, then coming through a pellet press, those will certainly melt. And of course, with any appreciable content of those type of fatty acids in the pellet will get soft. So in a practical sense, when that eventually ends up on a farm, particularly in the warmer weather conditions, those pellets will certainly risk being very soft. So that's certainly a risk with that. The other challenge, then, you can take that to the calcium salt forms. Very often it's trying to get higher palmitic acid into compounds while keeping pellet quality, which we can do more better, so to speak, with the calcium salt form of fat supplements. So calcium salts basically don't melt. There is then the challenge of being able to get that type of material through your feed mill, and that can require some basic variation in inputs, or, for example, the steam input into your feed mill for a particular diet. So certainly the one will act as a lubricant, one will act as will cause friction, so you get different challenges. But we can certainly help with that individually, as we do in many feed mills offline, if you want to follow up again on that one. But certainly we have made pellets of up to 60% calcium salt fairly successfully. In some cases, it can be quite challenging with as low as 3 or 4%. So it does depend a lot on the equipment and what else is in the diet, for example. But we certainly can give advice on what to look at for that.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks very much. I think I'm pushing it a bit, but I think we can probably squeeze in just one more question. So this is the next question. Do you think that increasing milk fat content of C16 naught is a desirable healthy result? I'll open that up to the panelists.
Jonas, you can comment?
I can comment, John, and then you can comment. I would say that yes, when you're driving more milk fat through driving C16, you're going to see an increase in the concentration of saturated fatty acids in the milk, palmitic mainly, which generates some questions on the health side. But when you look in general, that concentration, I don't think it's a huge increase that you're gonna see there, and I think if you look in the last few years, most of the literature looking to fatty acid composition in milk has demonstrated that that is benefits in the majority of the fatty acids that we have in the milk. So even the palmitic acid, we have to separate some of that. When you do some of the research trying to induce challenge, induce inflammation, usually what we do is you have a very high dose of that. In normal levels that you're drinking or eating butter or dairy products in general, you're not going to reach those levels. So I would say most of the literature showing that is benefits of including dairy products in the diet, and even at the levels that we are increasing palmitic acid on the milk, I don't see that as a challenge. I don't see that as a health challenge. John, maybe have some other comments on that.
The only thing I was going to add to that, Jonas, was the thing we always tend to forget, which is that milk does not contain fatty acids, it contains triglycerides.
Yeah.
In other words, you cannot really sort of judge until you know more about where those fatty acids are on the molecule of triglycerides. So I think it's too simplistic. However, I would say we do need more information on that point, and to do more detailed analysis of milk to know exactly where on the triglyceride the fatty acid is going. And I'd also just add that if you then look at the responses to the products with a ratio like the 60-30, you will not see an increase in palmitic content in milk with at that ratio in terms of relative concentration.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, John. We have got a number of questions come into the chat box, and I'm afraid we're not going to get time to go through all of those now. But what we will do is we'll follow up after the event. We know who's asked the questions, and we know how to contact you, so we can answer those for you. And I think that just leaves me to say thank you so much again for our expert speakers. It's been really lovely to hear from you all, and thank you again for the collaboration. And I hope you've all enjoyed it, and we will keep you posted about other events we have coming up. So please just follow our social channels to keep up to date with that. Thanks again, everyone. It's been a pleasure.